Hello and welcome back. This is the week 5 lecture. So today I would like us to finish Reuben and Rachel. So we will discuss volume 2. I of course covered volume 1 last week, and today I really want to point out some of the crucial differences between the two volumes. As we saw last week, as I discussed, volume 1 is largely historical fiction. Now, as several of you pointed out on the discussion board, yes, Ralston is taking great liberties with history, and she is fictionalizing much of the historical narrative that she is providing us in Volume 1. And she might be doing that to such an extent that we can't even really buy this as legitimate historical fiction. That is a fair criticism to make. But we also know from reading her preface that this whole book is supposed to serve a sort of instructional function. So in volume 1, she's sort of trying to spark young school children's interest in American history. And it does seem like in order to do that, she's using novelty and a certain degree of sort of fantastical storytelling in order to make the story perhaps a little more interesting or more compelling. And of course, to make Columbus and some of these early figures in American history into heroes, and to kind of paint this whole historical narrative in sort of heroic colors. So that sort of makes sense based on what we know she's trying to do. And then in volume 2, the instruction continues, but the focus changes. So volume 2 is not so much focused on history. Instead, the instruction it is trying to provide is moral instruction, largely geared toward young women. So this puts us back in mind of The Coquette and Charlotte Temple, the most famous book Ralston ever wrote, a very famous sentimental novel. I mentioned it a couple of weeks ago when we were still discussing The Coquette. So remember, a lot of sentimental fiction, a lot of seduction plots in particular were designed to teach a moral lesson. To sort of warn young women about the dangers of rakes and, improper conduct and sort of rash behavior and the trouble that can all lead to. So in volume 2, we get some of that. We get a lot more of the elements that would be commonly associated with sentimental fiction. So a lot of critics will say, volume 1 is historical fiction. Volume 2 is largely sentimental fiction. So there's a clear difference in genre that we can sort of navigate and discuss today. But there are a lot of other important changes as well. There's a general change in tone, I think, a slight change in style, perhaps. As the introduction points out, Ralston is no longer working with historical figures in Volume 2. This peculiar technique that we see her practice throughout volume 1 of sort of taking real figures from history and then fictionalizing them, changing certain details about their lives or actions. We talked about that last week. We don't really see that in volume 2. In volume 2, we stick to this fictional cast of characters that she has created. And although some of the action does take place in America, we do get some action, some adventure. The scope has narrowed. If volume 1 had a rather large scope, we covered a lot of ground, we covered a lot of time, and we saw a wide range of events. We traveled to Peru, we were in the Caribbean. We, of course, spent a lot of time in England, but then eventually we made our way to the future U.S. kind of late in volume 1. Volume 2 does not involve as much movement. It does not involve quite as much conventional action. So it's a little bit more domestic in nature. Much of it revolves around Rachel and her sort of struggles in society as she kind of has to make her own way. Meanwhile, her brother Reuben is making his way in America, trying to recover, his father's, land. So there was kind of two plots that we see at work in volume 2. There's Rachel's story and there's Reuben's. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I also want to talk about the very different treatment of Native Americans that we see in Volume 2 compared to what we saw in volume 1. So we, as we discussed last week, in volume 1, we see a lot of pretty favorable depictions of Native Americans. And what's also quite interesting, considering the time period in which this book debuted, the 1790s, the fact that we see a sort of frank treatment of interracial marriage. We see a couple of examples of that in volume 1 at the very beginning. Columbus's son, Ferdinando, marries Orabella, the Inca princess. That's a very improbable event, the way it's described. We kind of walked through that last week. But it is noteworthy because Ralston seems to sanction and approve of that union, which, wouldn't necessarily have been socially acceptable to a lot of people in the 1790s. And then later in volume 1, we see William Dudley, who you remember was kidnapped by the Narragansetts, a New England Native American tribe. And he grows up along with his sister, Rachel, not to be confused with the Rachel of the title, but I think it's the great aunt of the Rachel of the title. William and that Rachel get kidnapped as children, and they sort of grow up with the Narragansetts, and William eventually becomes their chief. Remember, we talked about that last week, and I asked a question about it on the discussion board. That does not take up a lot of space in the narrative, but it's a very weird sort of section. And again, Ralston is fairly tolerant and open-minded at times like those. However, and William eventually takes a Native American bride, again, the daughter of a chief, and then they marry and they have a child who is the elder Reuben, not the Reuben of the title, but the father of Reuben and Rachel. So at the end of volume 1, we saw the elder Reuben losing his wife shortly after childbirth, but the result of the birth is Reuben and Rachel of the title. That's how volume 1 ended. So when volume 2 picks up, that same Reuben is kind of just devoted to his children. He's a widower, but eventually he goes back to America to try to sort of reclaim or to try to establish a foothold really for the family. So the Reuben and Rachel of the title grow up in England, but eventually they're bound for America. But remember, this is a family with a sort of mixed heritage. So they're European and Native American. And early in volume 2, young Reuben, the Reuben of the title, discovers his family heritage. He discovers that his grandfather, William, was the chief of the Narragansetts. He learns that his grandmother was a Native American. So this is kind of a pivotal moment in the character development of Reuben, but I would argue that it's kind of glossed over, or at least treated relatively briefly. And we see a trend that continued, that we saw in volume 1, and it continues in volume 2, which is even when Ralston is depicting Native American characters somewhat favorably, she always sort of, privileges European religion, European culture. And the Native Americans who are good or admirable in this narrative are often sort of described or compared favorably to Europeans. And they readily adapt to certain aspects of European life, whether that means adopting the religion, agreeing to be ruled by European-style government. We see that from the very beginning when Columbus, lands in Peru, and the Inca king willingly agrees to give up a bunch of land and agrees to be ruled in the Spanish style. It's this kind of bloodless conquest that we talked about last week, not historically accurate, but it's part of this larger fictionalized version of American history that Ralston wants to tell. And I remember last week we talked about this idea of hybridization, this idea of America being sort of a hybrid nation, and a lot of these characters have very diverse background. So we talked about Columbia as kind of our protagonist of volume 1, and of course she descends from Native American royalty on one side and European royalty on the other. Well, that's true of Reuben and Rachel as well. Their grandmother was a Native American princess, and their grandfather, William Dudley, was a white Native American chief, and he also descends from a royal English family. So it's the same sort of motif, this recurring feature that we see throughout the book of, interracial romance, or at least throughout volume 1. We see interracial romance sort of approved, not just tolerated, but almost celebrated. But it has to take place between high-born Native Americans. It has to take place between Native American royalty and high-born Europeans. That type of a union is approved by Rowson throughout volume 1. But we'll notice that we don't see that happening in volume 2. So even though young Reuben learns about his heritage early in volume 2, he will later sort of implicitly reject it. Maybe not directly, but he'll certainly reject this legacy of interracial relationships or marriage, right? He will sort of deny his own family's history in the quest of some kind of racial purity that we didn't always necessarily see in volume 1, or at least we didn't see it championed and sort of privileged in volume 1 the way it is in volume 2. So Rowson's tone really changes, and her treatment of Native American characters really changes in volume 2. I want to explore that. I don't want to get too bogged down in plot because that can take a long time, and the plot is very complicated in this novel, as I'm sure you guys have noticed. There's a ton of characters, a ton of generations, a lot happens, a lot of the names get recycled. But again, I do want to return to the elder Reuben, because we kind of finished our discussion last week talking about him. He's an interesting figure because remember, he's the son of William and Oberea, the Narragansett princess. So he goes to England near the end of volume 1 and tries to claim his rightful inheritance as the grandson of Sir Ferdinando Gorgeous, that descendant of English nobility who had gone over to America. Remember, he's a descendant of Columbia, this part of this larger family tree. So Reuben goes to try to take what's his, but he's denied in England because of his mixed race background, because he has darker skin. Again, his mother's Native American, so his name does not help him because he's kind of shunned by English society due to his diverse background. So we talked about that at the end of volume 1. That's kind of interesting. And shortly after that, his wife dies after delivering his children, young Reuben and Rachel, who's named after his aunt Rachel, who was William's sister. And remember, they were taken into captivity together. So again, it's okay if some of these family relations are a little bit fuzzy for you. But in volume 2, things are a little bit more clear and crisp because we spend most of our time with Reuben and Rachel. We're not following nearly as many generations as we followed back in volume 1, but a lot happens to these two characters. So I want to explore both of their plots. Rachel's sort of domestic, sentimental style plot that unfolds largely in England, and then a little bit of what we see with Reuben in America. But just notice that in volume 2, the elder Reuben, who again is the product of William and Oberea's marriage. The elder Reuben and his two children are never really referred to as part Native American, or their mixed race heritage is not really mentioned except for that brief passage at the beginning of volume 2 when young Reuben is learning, he discovers his grandfather's headdress, and then his aunt or great aunt Rachel kind of fills in some of the details, tells him about the family history, and reveals to him that his grandmother was in fact a Native American princess. But notice that even as she praises Oberea, she has to compare her to a Christian. I think if you have my edition, you can flip over to page 198. So the young boy asks if she was quite a wild savage. And a move that's very typical for Rowson, the response is no, my dear. She was, I won't read the whole thing, but she was erroneously termed to be that. But in reality, says Auntie Rachel, she was as gentle, as compassionate, as full of virtue as any Christian. And this is typically how Ralston humanizes her Native American characters, as she compares them to Europeans, or she shows how willingly and sort of naturally they adapt to European ways. So we saw that even back with Orabella. And, back in Peru, they willingly adapted to the Spanish style that was introduced by Columbus. So again, Ralston's favorable depiction of Native Americans is never quite as favorable as maybe we would like it to be. It's always tinged with this sort of condescending air, this sense that the best ones among them, the best born, would of course aspire to be Europeans or would resemble Europeans in various ways. But even if we accept that's true, I still think she's doing some interesting things in Volume 1 with these sort of this sort of diverse genealogy that she's sharing with us. And again, she has this kind of alternate vision of American history, this idea of a fusion between Native American and European that, of course, it didn't quite unfold that way. There certainly was a cultural exchange, but it was more of a forced, violent sort of thing than what we see in Volume 1. But there is this sort of ideal of hybridization or a fusion, and again, we don't necessarily see that in Volume 2, at least not in the same way. So, yeah, a lot of other characters that we can talk about. I just want to mention another coquette that shows up in Volume 2 in the form of Mary, who I believe, so we learn a little bit about this guy, Jacob Holmes, who was taken over to America by the elder Reuben. He's some distant relative. And then we learn about his mother, Mary, who's sort of a ruined coquette. I think she was a cousin or a confidant, a friend of Keziah, the deceased wife of the elder Reuben. But what matters here is what I mentioned back in last week's lecture, when we have these coquette characters, just like we saw with Mina, and they kind of give rise to these corrupted family lines. So we saw this play out with Mina in Volume 1. She is seduced, and then she becomes pregnant, she gives birth, and then I think it's her grandson ends up emerging as kind of a villain in Volume 1. Something similar unfolds here in Volume 2 with Mary. She is also an attractive, witty, charming girl who is corrupted, seduced by a rake, and then as a result, she kind of, her it's suggested that characters like that, their family lines become, suspect or again somewhat corrupted. So we see Jacob kind of playing a villainous role. He's not developed very well, but he tries to essentially defraud the younger Reuben and, takes what had belonged to the father and tries to claim it for his own. We don't need to get into all those plot points, but again, just notice these patterns. We see multiple coquettes in this narrative, and Rachel herself is kind of perilously close at various times to kind of falling into that same trap. She is not morally suspect like some of these other women, but she makes a few bad decisions. She falls in with kind of the wrong crowd, and I want to talk about that as well. But she kind of is at various times sort of in danger of having her reputation sullied. So again, this is a recurring feature for Ralston, this idea that women have to constantly protect their virtue. And if they make mistakes, not even with the men who, they might be interested in, but even just the company they keep, their habits, whether or not they, pursue the right things. There's just a constant sort of struggle that we see not only here, but again, we see it in Charlotte Temple, we see it in other sentimental fiction. There's all these tests and obstacles, and they have to maintain their virtue at all times because, as we saw in the Coquette, they don't really have much else. A lot of them don't have money or means. And we see a lot of different characters who kind of serve as examples of fallen women who, either serve to tempt Rachel or to somehow kind of lead her from the right path. So Ralston's clearly interested in this, and we see a lot of iterations of that basic plot sort of play out throughout Volume 2. And then, meanwhile, we see Reuben back in America pursuing, his own ends. But I want to stick with Rachel just for a little while and talk a little bit more about the social commentary, particularly directed towards class distinctions that we see in Volume 2. So again, we're seeing a lot of what we would often associate with domestic fiction or sentimental fiction. So Rachel is kind of thrown out on her own. So remember, they're staying with their uncle, Hezekiah, who eventually dies. And by this point, Reuben so that the elder Reuben is dead, and the younger Reuben has gone to America to sort of, claim what is theirs. So Rachel, once her uncle dies, she has to kind of go and live with acquaintances of the family, Mrs. Webster and her family. So Rachel has to travel to London. She sort of has to leave the family abode. She doesn't really have protectors at this point. Her brother's abroad, her parents are dead, her uncle's dead. So she goes to London and she meets with a lot of misfortune. She lives with the Websters, and it's very interesting how Mrs. Webster and this particular group of characters is described in the text. So I actually want to turn here to page 249. So much of what happens to Rachel is based on the fact that she's kind of fallen in with people who are of a lower social class than her. So she doesn't necessarily come from money, but again, we know a lot about her family tree. We know that she descends from nobility on both sides. She has virtue. She has a certain degree of reputation, and that's not necessarily true of these other characters. So look over on page 249. Very interesting commentary on Mrs. Webster, who again is sort of an acquaintance of the family and is thought relatively highly of, but what's happened to her is she's had to go to work. So we see near the top of page 249, it frequently happens that those who are obliged to work incessantly for the support of their families, being wholly occupied in the hopes of bettering their fortune, become inattentive to appearances and overlook actions which earlier in life would have struck them with horror. And this is what's happened to Mrs. Webster. So in other words, she's become somewhat loose in terms of morals. She works hard to support her daughters, but because she has to work and support herself, she has sort of dropped in terms of social status. Essentially, she's become somewhat degraded by the responsibilities of work. So Rachel falling in with the Websters in this sort of larger circle that she becomes acquainted with in London, that has a lot of negative consequences for her. A lot of bad things happen as a result. She's able to maintain her virtue, but she's challenged quite a bit. So again, we have kind of a typical sentimental plot here, full of pertaining to Rachel. We have all of these unlikely occurrences, lots of hardships that she has to endure, a lot of conniving people that sort of come across her path, many of them women. And then, of course, the ultimate triumph of the heroine. But in the midst of all that, a lot of it's kind of formulaic, but we do get some interesting passages, and I marked one on 254 that I just wanted to glance at. This is kind of a fun exchange between Rachel and the corrupt lawyers who are sort of playing hardball with her and her brother and sort of denying them an opportunity to get their hands on the father's estate. There's all kinds of sort of legal chicanery that's going on here that isn't always necessarily explained very well. But we know that Jacob and these lawyers are kind of bad guys. They're trying to cheat Reuben and Rachel knows it, and she really stands up for herself. And there's this great exchange. I won't read the whole thing, But at one point, one of the lawyers says, "You are too warm, my fair lady," meaning she's getting kind of heated, she's getting a little bit upset. And then her response, "Pardon me, I do not think I am warm enough." So this is kind of a fun exchange, and we see some real growth in Rachel. I mean, she's again kind of on her own. She makes a few missteps, right? She kind of spends time with some of these lower class characters, but we can kind of, well, readers are intended to sort of forgive her that fault. It's mostly, stemming from a good nature, nothing else. So, we have a lot of villains that come across her path. We have the La Varone woman, who again is sort of a conniver and sort of a former coquette who was sort of a kept woman. Now she's kind of on her own. She doesn't really have a lot of money, but she's still somewhat attractive, and she's trying to ensnare a man. So she's presented as kind of a villainess. Later we see a Mrs. Varnus. The whole Webster crew really kind of turns against Rachel. Initially, they're just kind of indifferent, and they're not really smart or cultured like she is. And again, they just don't really belong to the same social class as Rachel. And it's, again, suggested that at least Mrs. Webster, perhaps when her husband was still alive, maybe she belonged to a slightly higher class, but she's been lowered in class status because now she works for her living. That kind of takes up all of her time, so she's no longer paying attention to appearances. She's no longer maintaining propriety in the same way. And again, all of this affects Rachel. We even see that guy, Mr. Spriggins, again, sort of presented as a lowly sort. Not necessarily a villain, but just a lower class person who lacks education, lacks culture, lacks polish, and doesn't understand social distinctions. And this is something that becomes very important to Ralston in Volume 2. She spends a lot of time talking about social distinctions, and somebody like Spriggins doesn't really understand that somebody like Hamden Albury, the handsome, dashing suitor of Rachel, just naturally belongs to a higher class and can't really be bothered to condescend to, even talk to somebody of Spriggins's origin. So there's a lot of class commentary that would not necessarily strike us, should not necessarily strike us as democratic in the sort of traditional sense, because Ralston wants to make it a point here that a lot of these characters that kind of bring Rachel down, their lower class. So actually, if we flip over to 271, this is the passage with Spriggins and this idea that although there is a natural equality of man, if you look down near the bottom of the page, there still needs to be a necessary subordination. There needs to be inferiors and superiors, right? Those who have shining abilities, liberal education, and superior understanding need to remain above the Sprigginses of the world, above the Websters and the circle that they sort of keep. And remember, when Albury kind of sees Rachel hanging out with these people, his sensibilities are really kind of shocked. He's just like, oh, you're not situated properly. These aren't the right kinds of people for you. You're superior to them. You shouldn't be interacting with them as if you are equals. So again, there's a lot of class consciousness that kind of rises to the top in Volume 2, and it might not be exactly what we expect to find in this history of America. But again, so much of this takes place in England, and we're obviously dealing with some class prejudice that's probably been inherited, at least in part, from England. So that's kind of interesting to reflect on. Rachel, again, kind of gets perilously close to meeting a sort of coquette-like fate, even though she herself is not portrayed as a coquette. But at one point, she is sort of accused of carrying on and acting improperly. We know that's not the case, but her reputation does withstand some punishment. She's kind of cast out at various times, but eventually things work out for her, and she does end up with Albury, and just like Rachel, kind of veers dangerously close at times to coquette territory in this narrative. Alberry is kind of almost a rake. Like, remember, he marries her, but he makes her take an assumed name. He doesn't want to lose his fortune. His rich family would disown him if he marries Rachel because she doesn't have any money. So again, that might remind us a little bit of Sanford and the reasons he wouldn't marry Eliza back in the Coquette. But Alberry's not really a rake. He eventually kind of straightens out, but he is presented as vain, and he's very concerned about appearances and money. But eventually his love for Rachel wins out. That makes him a better, in this kind of a world, he's obviously better than Sanford. But I want to turn now to Reuben and some of his adventures in America, because there's some really interesting stuff going on here, and I'll keep it brief. I've already kind of summarized it, but again, let's just turn quickly to page 298. Look at the different tone that Ralston is adopting now towards Native American characters. So, yeah, it's true that the only Native Americans that she bothers to talk about in any detail in Volume 1 are Noble. But remember that brief passage we looked at last week as well, where she says that the English settlers were responsible for a lot of the violence and conflict, and that when Native Americans retaliated or took hostages, they were kind of justified because the settlers kind of started it. Remember, we saw that near the end of Volume 1, and we were struck by that, or at least I was, because again, that's not typical of the 1790s. But remember that. Remember how she's willing to put the blame on the settlers back in Volume 1. But in Volume 2, it's a very different approach. So now she's talking about the treachery and rapacity of these savages. And there's a military force sent to expel them, and young Reuben signs up and goes off to fight. But also notice that the military force has to guard the lives and properties of the inoffensive settlers. That's how they're described here on page 298. Inoffensive. That's like the opposite of how they were described in Volume 1. So it's almost like a course correction here. Ralston almost seems like she wants to distance herself from some of the multicultural and sort of open-minded depictions that we saw in Volume 1. Not only the prevalence of interracial marriage, which we do not see in Volume 2, but also the willingness to put blame on the settlers, even back at the beginning of Volume 1. Even though she sort of exonerates Columbus, she still does point out that certain Spaniards obviously pillaged and raped and did terrible things. But in Volume 2, she's really not interested in placing any blame at the feet of the settlers. And instead, she's really painting the Native Americans in broad strokes. None of the Native American characters are very well developed. And we even get another repetition, another captivity narrative. In this case, Reuben and his Irish manservant are kidnapped, this time by Mohawks. But in a similar thing, they're going to be ransomed back in exchange for Native American prisoners. But this captivity narrative doesn't strike me as being as interesting as the one that we saw back in Volume 1. It's very brief, and again, there's no fusion, there's no hybridity. The grandson of William, Reuben, has no interest in doing as William. He doesn't take a Native American bride. He doesn't marry into the tribe. He doesn't have that kind of a relationship with his captors. He doesn't seem interested in pursuing any kind of future relationship with them. And if you look on page 306, again, there's not even a mention here as he talks about, he remembers his grandfather, William, and then we hear that Reuben had seen too much of savage men and manners to have a wish to remain amongst them, even though he might have been elevated to the highest seat of dignity, like his grandfather, William. But there's no mention here that Reuben is again part Native American. It's not, his grandmother was Native American. His grandfather was a chief, yet he rejects all of that kind of casually, kind of just immediately without much consideration. And Ralston seems to accept that as the rightful course of action. So just a very different approach. And then, of course, at the end, we kind of have a happy ending. The love interest of Reuben, Jesse, arrives in America along with Rachel. So Rachel ends up with Aubrey. Reuben ends up with Jesse, and they do get a chance to inherit their rightful titles and land and money because they are the descendants of Edward Dudley and Arabella, and all of that stuff that was supposed to come their way, it finally does. But in sort of an American style gesture, they reject the titles. They want to be American. They take some of the land and they give the rest of it to indigent family members. So in other words, poor relations. So in that final move, that's a kind of an all-American move that Ralston's making. We're rejecting European nobility, the titles, the history. But this particular family history is worthy of sort of holding up and celebrating. But again, the nature of the family changes. They become more narrow. The fusion, the hybridity of Volume 1 is nowhere to be found in Volume 2. The Native Americans are now just savages. The settlers are blameless. So we've ended up in a more conventional place by the end of Volume 2. And we need to figure out why. Was Ralston afraid of pushback? We don't need to consider Ralston herself even. But why does the tone, the style, and the manner change so much by the end of Volume 2? It's the same family, but by the end of Volume 2, it seems very much like a white family in ways that they didn't always necessarily seem like in Volume 1. So where does the hybridity go, and why does it go away? That might be worth asking. Why does the portrait of Native Americans change? And why do we shift to a more sentimental mode of fiction in Volume 2? I would argue that Rachel kind of takes a more privileged position. Even though Reuben does important stuff, we probably spend more narrative time with Rachel. So ask some questions. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you next week.